Good evening and welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight with you all, and I'm very happy to be your host for tonight. My name is Randy Jansen, and welcome to the MIR Center for Peace lecture series. Tonight, we're very privileged and honored to have Dr. Wade Davis with us tonight. Now, I'm wondering, just before we get started, is it possible to turn on the house lights just for a second? I want to see you all. I wonder who's here, because, you know, we're all connected in so many ways. And I think there's a big group of high school students from School Division 20. Is that correct? Who's here from SD 20? Are you from Castlegar Trail? Great, welcome. And what about LVR or Self-Design High? We have other local high school students? Welcome. What about environmentalists? Who here is an environmentalist? Who here is a musician, an author, or an artist? I figured that would be everybody. Who here is an owner or a manager or works for a local business? We're all connected, right? Who here is a supporter of Idle No More? Who still wants to learn more about the history of this land we live on? Particularly the history that predates European settlers. On that note, I just want to put a plug. I'll put two plugs in quickly. A number of Wade Davis's books are for sale at the back, if you haven't noticed. But there's also local author Eileen Perks. Her book, Geography of Memory, is also on sale in the back. Outer Books is selling it as well. And for many of you probably know Geography of Memory, but it's an exploration of life in this area before European settlers, particularly the legacy of the Sinaiks people who have lived here for thousands of years. So feel free, I encourage you to buy that book tonight. So one more thing, who cares about food? And the reason I say that is because tomorrow night starts the Food Film Festival. What's the proper name? Sorry, I'm Deconstructing Dinner, thanks. So I'm assuming you all got tickets for that. Yes. Okay. Anyway, those are all our connections. So it's great to identify yourselves and see how we're all together here tonight. You can turn down the lights now if you want. Before we get started, we have a special introductory special guest, short performance by Wilk Laddie. Wilk Laddie is a poet, a student at Selkirk College, and in peace studies, I might add. He is from the northwest coast and now lives on Sinaiks territory. And through some bizarre combination of land, time, salmon, chance, ancestors, and the machinations of the colonial authority, he is here with us tonight. So I welcome Wilk Laddie.
Oh, it's such a big crowd, but I can't really see you because of this light. A poet. I usually do poetry, but I haven't been able to write much lately because, well, with Idle No More, I've got this. I had a lot in my mind, and 2 weeks ago, I'm from the Nisga'a people. That's up north of Prince Rupert on the coast. In 2000, we signed the first modern treaty in British Columbia, and 2 weeks ago, the governments of Canada and British Columbia violated that treaty. And that's important to me. I've not lived there. So when I was 3 weeks old, I was sent 1,000 miles from my mother, her people, and our lands. Google the 60s scoop. It was part of the policy of assimilating the indigenous people of the lands colonially known as Canada, in an attempt to kill the Indian. They tried it with guns, gunboats, smallpox, starvation, relocation, reservations, and residential schools. Adoption to white families was just another way of many which the colonial entity has used to attempt the eradication of the indigenous people. I am of the Nishka, Kaliakshilisms, and the children of Kamliji Hala. My mother is Nishka. Her mother is Nishka. Her mother was Nishka, all the way back to just after the Great Flood. I found all that out when I was 26. Grew up thinking I was Shimshin, because that's what my adopted family was told. Apparently knowing who my people are was not important or too important for me to know. And so I'm only an Indian. I only know a few words of our language, none of my songs, and only a few of my stories. I've never lived in my ancestral home, and I've only danced with my people once. I have blood without knowledge, a plastic card and a number, 67101-49301. And this is why I'm only an Indian. I actually wouldn't have been that hard to assimilate me, since everyone longs to belong. But some of the white kids I've gone to school with were really mean, and I've heard every racist thing there is to say about Indians. Been in a lot of fights, never won, never lost either. Never finished school, and even though I tried really hard, I failed to learn that who I am was something bad. But I did learn some other things about being an Indian. When I was 4 or 5, with either school or daycare, we went to the park, out into the forest, and the warden for the colonial authority gave us paper headbands and little feathers of some kind. We put them on our heads, and she had us run around and slap our mouths and make that goddamn sound they make in movies where the Indians always lose. Then she told us about how a long time ago there used to be Indians who lived here, but that they were gone now. No one ever asked where they went. Then she told us all about how Indians were really good hunters and how quiet they were. And for like 30 years now, I've practiced shooting and being really quiet in the woods. I once had to tell an elk that I was here so he wouldn't step on me. I've taken a moose at something like 600 yards with 2 shots through almost the same hole. Later, my first grade teacher told us about Mohawk Warriors, and how they took scalps and could jump down from a tree and flatten 20 men. He said that when they were captured and tortured, it was a symbol of strength and honor not to make a noise. So I practiced not reacting to pain. Big needles and broken bones don't make me change my facial expression. Anyway, I'm tough. Pretty sure a lot of Indians are. I'm saying you could flay me and I might smile at you. But it wasn't until I learned of the ancestors from a man I now call grandfather that I began to understand what it was to be indigenous. For most of my life, I had no idea about my ancestors, no idea that right now, right next to me, and all around me, the ancestors exist, and that they are here to help me in this world. When I was a baby, my adopted mother had a vision in which there was a ring of Indians circling the house. One of them stepped forward and told them that they were there to protect me. And it makes so much sense. I've been in like 9 car accidents, 10 or 20 fights, been threatened with a gun, a knife, actually shot at by a crazy pants white man once, and I'm not dead. And luck is not a sufficient explanation for how. So you can hide me from my people, but only those of this world. Indigenous children have been given to white people in hopes that we will assimilate. Harper hopes we can assimilate. The colonial corporations want us to assimilate. And apparently, according to the Colonial Propaganda Authority, 62% of Canadians want us to assimilate. I have something to say to that. If you want to kill this Indian, you're going to actually have to do it. And that will not ever happen, as I have the ancestors to protect me. And this year, for the first time, I feel I have my people. Have you heard their drums? Have you heard their songs? Have you seen the indigenous people dancing? We're not going anywhere. surrender any hope to the contrary. Now is our time. Am dim dip am gol will loch kanye etgum. Toyak senisms.
Thank you very much, Will. Is it possible to have the house lights up just a little bit? Thank you. Now, I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to a man who needs no introduction. Wade Davis is an author, a photographer, an explorer, an anthropologist, and an ethnobotanist. Born right here in British Columbia, Dr. Wade Davis is known throughout the world for his focus on Indigenous cultures in general, and in particular, the use of Indigenous plants for medicinal and other purposes. Tonight, he is here to impress upon us the importance of the wisdom of Indigenous cultures, particularly so that we do not lose this vast archive of knowledge and expertise. So it's my pleasure to welcome Wade Davis.
Well, thank you, Randy. Thank you, Will, for that heartfelt set of remarks. You know, I hope this talk tonight may, in a way, be in some small way, soothe your soul, because there's so much to celebrate. And I'm delighted to be back in Nelson. It sort of feels like a hometown. My grandfather was a doctor in Kimberley in the 1920s, and I've always had a great affection for the Kootenays, and I always have such a great affection for British Columbia, and I just want to let you know that I've sort of decided to come back to British Columbia, and I've taken a professorship at UBC, a tenured professorship in anthropology. Because many of you know that I've fought for a decade with my Tahltan brothers and sisters to protect the Sacred Headwaters, and it really is time for all Canadians to come together to bring down this federal government and to re-envision a new dream of Canada. But, you know, I was last in Nelson, I checked about 5 or 6 years ago, so I'm going to tell you some old stories tonight, but definitely some new stories. And, you know, I often begin these remarks on culture, and this is really an attempt to distill the 5 Massey lectures that I gave in 2009 into a single talk, so it's going to be a long ride. But, you know, one of the great pleasures, as I always say, about travel and the chance to be with Indigenous people is indeed the opportunity to live amongst people who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, and taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to really remember the central revelation of anthropology, and one cannot say this enough. And that is the idea that the world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder in the slopes of Chomolungma, an eagle hunter of central Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman of Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of orienting yourself in social, spiritual, and ecological space. And that is an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up this web of life that I've often described as being an ethnosphere. And it's a web of life as important to the well-being of humanity as is the biological web of life that embraces the planet. And, In an early book, I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and myths, intuitions and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great achievement. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and all that we can achieve as a wildly creative and imaginative species. And as I've said so many times, just as the biosphere is being eroded with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but of course at a far more dire rate of corruption. No biologist, for example, would dare suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund or on the brink of extinction. And yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And of course, the great indicator of that is language loss. And as you all know, as in the year that you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language is not simply a body of vocabulary or a set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material realm. Every language, I once wrote, is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that we were born, irrefutably, according to linguistic academics, fully half of them are not being whispered into the ears of infants. They're not being taught to children, which means that effectively they're already dead. And of course, there are many people, particularly in the dominant society, who say, you know, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my answer to that is, of course, always to say, what a brilliant idea. But let's make that universal language Nuptatuk. Let's make it Nishka. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Quechua, Tibetan. And suddenly you begin to feel what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. But that dreadful plight is indeed the plight of somebody somewhere on earth every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder, man or woman, passes away and carries with them into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. Now, the reason this is so tragic is that it's occurring in the very same generation wherein finally geneticists have proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always dreamt to be true, and that is the fact that we are all irrefutably, literally brothers and sisters. Now, I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a single continuum. Race has been exposed as an utter fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We are indeed all descendants of a handful of individuals who walked out of the Rift Valley roughly 65,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary diaspora, a Hijra 40,000 years in duration, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But if you accept the irrefutable truth that we are all cut from the same genetic cloth, you have to accept the corollary, and that is the fact that by definition, all human cultures share the same raw genius, the same mental acuity, the same human potential, and whether that genius is indeed invested into technological works of wizardry, which has been the great achievement in the West, or by contrast, placed into the challenge of unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth. The primary concern, for example, of the Aboriginal people of Australia is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no progression in the affairs of culture. There is no ladder to success that rises to the apex of the pyramid that places Victorian England at the top and then sweeps down the sides to the so-called primitives of the world. Quite to the contrary, the revelations of modern science has reaffirmed the essential connectedness of humanity and the other peoples of the world, and this is what it really means in terms of a fundamental lesson. It means that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you, they're not failed attempts at being modern. Quite to the contrary, each culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those answers collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. But the challenge really becomes then, what do we do about it? When I was recruited to the National Geographic more than a decade ago as part of our conservation initiative, it was with a specific mandate to change within a decade the way that the world viewed and valued culture. It was an enormous challenge because, after all, in the realm of biological diversity, if you identify an area of high species endemism, you can create a protected area. But you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't freeze people in time like some kind of zoological specimen. Change, in fact, is the one constant in culture. So we decided, after much soul-searching and many academic sessions, that the way to change the way the world views and values culture is not through polemics, which are never persuasive, and certainly not through politics, as we know politics to exist today, where the politicians never really lead us anywhere. The thought we had is that perhaps we could change the world through narrative, through storytelling, because storytellers have always been the ones who have in fact changed the course of history. And so over a decade ago, 12 years ago in fact, I set off to do a series of journeys to the Ethnosphere, if you will, where I would take our incredible audience of over 300 million people a month in 165 languages, and in 37 languages, I should say, in 165 countries all around the world. And I would take that audience to places in the Ethnosphere where the belief systems and the practices were so inherently dazzling that you could not help but come away with a new appreciation of the wonder and the contribution of culture. And so, for example, I made a film with my good friend Matthieu Ricard that we called The Buddhist Science of the Mind. Well, you might wonder why we use the word science to describe what you think of as a religion. But what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? And what is Tibetan Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct empirical observation as to the nature of mind? I remember Matthieu said to me, Tibetan Buddhism is not about the twiddling of thumbs. He said, Western science is too often a major response to minor needs. We spend all of our lifetimes in the West trying to live to be 100 without losing our teeth. We in Tibet, he said, spend all of our lifetimes trying to understand the nature of existence, the meaning of death. He said that your billboards in the West celebrate naked teenagers in underwear. Our billboards are manuals, prayers for the well-being of all sentient creatures. So tonight I'm going to share with you some stories that I may have shared with you 5 years ago from the early days of this initiative, but much of what I will remark upon will be new to you. And so we began this quest, this journey into the ethnosphere by going to the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination. And of course, this is Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon the southern sea. And I was fortunate to be able to sail on the Hokulea, named after the sacred star of Hawaii, with the Polynesian Voyaging Society, an organization of native Hawaiian men and women who have literally in a single generation revitalized their culture and brought forth an entirely new dream of the earth. And even today, the men and women of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name readily 350 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who, in the darkness of the hull of the vessel, can sense as many as 4 or 5 different sea swells moving through the sacred canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the Pacific and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. But the most remarkable thing about this tradition of navigation is that it was all based on dead reckoning, which meant that you only knew where you were by remembering precisely how you got there. Now, it was a very impossibility of using dead reckoning on a long oceanic voyage that caused European transports to hug the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for an absolute fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians from an ancient civilization called Lapita, off the shores of New Caledonia and New Guinea, set sail into the rising sun. In 1,000 years, they reached Samoa and Tonga, where the movement stopped for a millennium. But then it began again and traveled 4,000 kilometers across the Central Pacific, through the Cook Islands, the Society Islands, the Marquesas. And then it moved northwest to discover Hawaii, southeast to discover Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. And eventually, around the time of the First Crusade, they made landfall in a place that we now know as New Zealand. And this entire journey was based on the visionary realm of the Wayfinder, who throughout the multi-week journey had to sit monk-like on the stern of the vessel, remembering in his mind every shift of wind, every shift of current, every sign of the seas, every sign of the celestial bodies, the stars, the moon, and the sun itself. And this represented a utilization of the human imagination equal to anything that was ever achieved in the West. And my good friend Nainoa Thompson tells a remarkable story of when the Hokulea, which now is incidentally sailing around the world in this great celebration of Polynesian vision and culture, when Nainoa decided to pull Rapa Nui out of the sea. The marvelous metaphor in Polynesian wayfinding is the vessel itself never moves at all. It is the axis mundi of civilization. It is the compass itself. And through the vision of the wayfinder, the islands are pulled out of the sea. And so they set out to pull Rapa Nui out of the Pacific. This implied on a journey from Oahu, traveling 6,000 miles, crossing the doldrums, tacking into the wind for 2,500 miles, all to reach an island that was less than 25 kilometers across, less than a degree on a compass, had indeed a compass been on board the vessel. But there was no compass on the Hokulea, there was no sextant, there was certainly no GPS. There were only the ancient skills of the navigator and the visions and the hopes and dreams of a people whose culture was reborn with every moment that the Hokulea sailed. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere to the greatest forest on Earth, we enter the heartland of the Amazon. Joseph Conrad famously said the tropical rainforest was less a forest than a primeval mob, a remnant of an ancient era when vegetation rioted and consumed the world. And if we enter the homeland of the Barasana, a people of the Anaconda who believed that mythologically they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent, only to be regurgitated onto the various affluents of the northwest Amazon, a people who live so intimately with that forest homeland that cognitively they do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the rainforest. And if we slip south into the homeland of the Waorani, a remarkable people, remarkable because they were first peacefully contacted in 1958, 5 years after I was born. In 1957, 5 missionaries attempted contact. They dropped from the air 8 by 10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we would say to be friendly gestures, forgetting that the people of the forest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. So they picked up the photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to find the form to the figure, found nothing, and concluded that these were calling cards from the devil, and they promptly speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Waorani didn't just spear outsiders. 54% of their mortality was due to them spearing each other. We traced genealogies back 8 generations and found only 2 cases of natural death. And eventually, it turned out that one of the fellows had gotten so old that he died getting old, so they speared him anyway. What had indeed happened is at the time of contact, a neighboring society had been eliminated by disease, and the Waorani had found themselves enmeshed into a kind of Hatfield-McCoy series of blood feuds where the only knowledge they had of the outside world was that all outsiders were kawade, or cannibals, and they lived in a perpetual state of war, intertribal war within their territory. But they were still a remarkable people. Their hunters had such a perspicacious knowledge of the forest that they could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left it behind. Again, not because they were sauvage in a Rousseauian sense, but rather because they were true natural philosophers who, through empirical observation, had come to understand a forest homeland upon which their lives depended. And this acute knowledge of the botanical realm, of course, is what first brought me to the Amazon. I was very fortunate to attend Harvard College in the early 1970s and fall into the orbit of this remarkable man I wrote about in the book One River, Richard Evans Schultes, a kindly professor who shot blowguns in class, kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available as an optional laboratory experiment, and was something of a legend for his ability to get students off marijuana convictions. And the argument went like this: by legal statute in the United States, cannabis sativa was illicit. But Schultes and a small minority of botanists maintained that there were in fact 2 other species of this plant that had been used by human beings for 4,000 years, including Cannabis ruderalis and Cannabis indica. And that left the burden of proof in a criminal prosecution on the prosecution to prove that a ground-up bag of pot was in fact sativa as opposed to one of its botanical cousins. And since even the botanists couldn't agree on how many species there were, it was by definition an impossible task. And none of the students could understand these arcane points of botanical nomenclature and taxonomy, but they did appreciate the kindly professor's ability to break open the courtrooms and set the students free. But Schultes was an odd choice to become a 60s icon. True, he had sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery in 1938 in Mazatec country in Mexico of the so-called magic mushrooms, but his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't believe in the American Revolution. He was a monarchist who, every presidential cycle, voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. One of his colleagues said of Schultes that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. And I knew none of this history when I, at the age of 19, rapped on his 4th floor Erie office at the Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." Well, that's all it took, that adjective. I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon and collect plants as you did. I think if I had done that to a Canadian professor, given that I knew nothing of the Amazon and had not taken a biology course in my life, even in high school, a Canadian professor, I think, would have thrown me out of the office. But instead, this man who had spent 12 uninterrupted years in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, a man for whom mountains and national parks had been named in South America, a man who Prince Philip called the father of the Amazon, simply peered across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, and just before going, in order to placate my very English mother in Victoria, I dropped by his office to get some final pointers before I set off on a one-way journey to the Amazon, having vowed to stay away from America until Richard Nixon was no longer president. And he had 3 vital pieces of advice. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. And then he said not to forget to wear a pith helmet because in 13 years he had never lost his bifocals. And his 3rd piece of advice, which most assuredly did not placate my mother, was that I was not to come back from the Amazon without trying ayahuasca, the vision vine, the most potent of the hallucinogenic preparations of the shaman's repertoire. But just before leaving his office, he also turned to me and he said, never forget what Paracelsus, the great Swiss scholar, said, that the difference between a poison, a medicine, a narcotic, and a hallucinogen is just dosage. So he was telling me to keep my eye out for any plants of biodynamic properties. And this invariably led into the realm of the curandero, the maestro, the shaman. And of course, he was quite right. Here, for example, you see an old friend of mine from the Kofan people preparing the flying death, curare, the dart and arrow poisons, which, of course, yielded in the 1940s detubo-curaring, the muscle relaxant that revolutionized abdominal surgery. And invariably, this quest for psychoactive and pharmacologically active plants led us into the realm of the shaman. Now, if you follow the scholarly work of those great ethnographers like Shirley MacLaine, you would think that the shaman is sort of a grandfather figure with bells and whistles who sings a lot. And I've been with an awful lot of shaman in my life. I've never been with one who wasn't a little psychotic. I mean, that's their job, as Joseph Campbell said. They're the ones who swim in the mystic waters the rest of us would drown in. They're the ones who go into the metaphysical realms that most of us want to avoid as we're raising our children, as would be the case of any family in any community. And to understand the shamanic art of healing, you have to recognize that diseases are not defined as states in which the individual is suffering from the presence of pathogens, but disease is seen as a state of psychological, spiritual imbalance in which the spiritual, social, psychological components of the human being are not in proper equilibrium. Health, by contrast, is defined in explicitly positive terms in a state, as a state of balance. And remember that the word health, holy, and whole derives in English from the Anglo-Saxon root hail, meaning completeness and oneness. And so shaman, despite what sort of romantic ideas often have very little to do with medicinal plants. Amongst the people of the Anaconda, the shaman never deals with medicinal plants. Generally, it's the women who are dealing every day with the ailments of the children who know most about the medicinal flora of a particular region, because for the shaman to do his deeds of mystical rescue, he must or she must invoke some technique of ecstasy to soar away on the wings of trance, to get into those very distant metaphysical realms where they can work their deeds of medical, mystical, and magical rescue. And that accounts for one of the most curious anomalies in botanical science, and that is the fact that of the 125 or so known hallucinogenic plants, fully 90% are from the Americas and Siberia. Again, not because the forests of equatorial West Africa were depauperate, or the forests of other parts of the planet, but simply because in those other regions people found other conduits to the divine. And in the Americas, the route to the Godhead invariably was mediated by the ingestion of these curious plants. Like here you can see in a photograph taken by Schultes in the 1950s, Yanomami people in the upper reaches of the Orinoco in Venezuela blowing up the nose this legendary powder, ebene, the semen of the sun, derived from the blood-red resin of several species in the genus Virola in the nutmeg family. These powders are chock full of tryptamines, close to brain serotonin, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine. My old buddy Terence McKenna used to say that to have this stuff blown up your nose was like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It created not the distortion of reality, it created the utter disillusion of reality. I used to argue with Professor Schultes that you couldn't classify this as hallucinogenic because by the time you were under the influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucinations. But we're drawn to these remarkable plants because what they can tell us about a different way of knowing. The main preparation of the Amazon is indeed ayahuasca. It's a combination of plants. Now, the reason those tryptamines are blown up the nose is because they're orally inactive. Tryptamines are denatured by monoamine oxidase, an enzyme found naturally in the human stomach. They can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other plant that denatures the MAO in the human stomach. So ayahuasca is a combination of the leaves of a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, and the woody bark of a liana in a completely different family of plants, the Malpighiaceae, which has within its bark beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, which turn out to be MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines in the shrub. Now, you don't have to worry about the biochemistry of that, but you have to ask yourself a question. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the indigenous people learn to combine these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest in this powerful synergistic way to create the biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which is quickly exposed statistically to be a meaningless euphemism. You ask the indigenous elders, and they say, well, don't you know anything about botany? The plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? When Schultes lived with the Siona Sequoia in 1941, he recorded 17 unique varieties of the liana alone, all of which the indigenous people recognized and distinguished with some ease at great distances in the forest, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as being the same species. He asked them the nature of their classification. Once again, they looked at him as if he were a fool, and they said what any student of plants would know, that you take each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each variety sings to you in a different key. Now, that's not going to get you a PhD in plant systematics at UBC, but it's a hell of a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. It also speaks to the profundity of the knowledge of the natural philosophers of the Amazon. And one of the most extraordinary things in all of this work is to realize the vicious hold that academic orthodoxy can have on a discipline, and to realize that just when we think we know something about a place, we discover how little we know. All of you who went to college in the 1970s or the 80s, like myself, were told that the Amazon was this counterfeit paradise, a forest of immense biological sophistication built on a foundation of sand. Remove that canopy of the forest, you set in motion a chain reaction of biological destruction, of cataclysmic consequences. And that kind of dire prognosis became a mantra which we used to open every scientific paper we wrote on the ethnobotany of the Amazon rainforest. Now, what that was attempting to do was to distinguish the obvious, that in a temperate forest with the periodicity of the seasons, a rich accumulation of organic material, the biological capital of the forest is the living soil, which at least suggests why sustained yield forestry should be at least a theoretical possibility. But in the tropics, with the high rate of humidity, decomposition, the soil scarcely has a chance to form before it's recycled into the living vegetation, which is indeed the capital of the rainforest. So that was a useful distinction to, in a general sense, distinguish the two fundamental different ecosystems. But when applied to a landmass 7 times the size of Ontario, it was as much slogan as science. 50 years of field research has shown that a third of the Amazon is savanna. There are areas of land in the Amazon, collectively the size of France, in the upland forest, of rich black soils of human origin. The idea that this was this fragile place where through slash and burn agriculture, a very delicate population could barely survive by cutting the forest, burning it, cropping it for one season, then moving on, we now know there was every incentive to slash, burn, and stay put. And these soils of human origin are a shadow of a dawn of time when we know there were great civilizations in the Amazon. All you had to do is follow the journals of Aureliana, who the first European to sail down the Amazon in 1541. He reached the confluence of the Napo River and the Ucayali in Peru. It was said that he went temporarily insane. He could not imagine a river of such scale on God's earth. God knows what awaited him 2,500 miles downstream where the Amazon itself becomes like an inland sea. As he moved down the Amazon, his journals recorded by the Dominican friar Carvajal are a constant record of dense, vast concentrations of human beings that harassed his ship all the way down the forest. We now know from the archaeological record the Amazon was not an empty place. It became an empty place in the consequence of the ravages of diseases that swept away the populations, not decimating the populations. I don't like that word because decimate in Latin means to kill 1 in 10. With the arrival of European pathogens in the New World, it wasn't 1 in 10 who died, it was 9 in 10. 90% of the Amerindian civilizations from Tierra del Fuego in the south to the high Arctic in the north were swept away, often within a generation of contact. And the question that has echoed through recent scholarship is there a place in the Amazon where the voices of these ancient civilizations can still be heard? Is there a place where their descendants can be found? And we now know that there is such a place, and it's in the northwest forests of Colombia, in the very homeland of the Barasana, the Tanimucos, and Macunas. All of our ethnographic interpretation of the Amazon has been based on our experiences of societies like the Waorani, who lived at the margins of the basin, isolated by geography from the east, by the Andean Cordillera from the west. And by the time anthropologists in numbers entered the Amazon in the 1940s and 50s, the main basin had been depopulated, and we were drawn to the so-called real Indians. And these societies tend to be, like the Waorani, isolated, endogenous, living amongst themselves, often in open conflict with their neighbors. That became the iconic image of the delicacy of life in the Amazon, a notion that fed an environmental agenda, but frankly was not accurate in terms of our understanding now of history. And when we go into the homeland of the Barasana, we find them living in longhouses the size of this room, which in their architectural sophistication and symbolic resonance rival anything the Inca or the Aztec or the Maya ever built. They live in a world where the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom is the most prized of all manly pursuits. They live by social structures that facilitate trade and exchange and peace, not war, not the least of which is a marriage rule that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a foreign language. They simply wait, watch, listen, and one day begin to speak. And we now know that their incredibly Baroque cosmologies, their mythologies, amount to nothing more or less than a very precise land management plan that dictates exactly how human beings in vast numbers can in fact live in the upland reaches of the Amazon forest. And to think of how close these voices came to be extinguished. In the 1970s, when I first lived with the Barasana, the villages were so dominated by missionaries, it felt that something important had happened here, but it happened a long time ago. My friend Stephen Hugh Jones, the chair of anthropology at Cambridge University, in the early 1970s was part of a BBC strand of films called Disappearing Worlds, in which he predicted the demise of these people. When I returned just 3 years ago to make a film with my good friend Martin van Hildebrand and the indigenous organizations of Akaipi, Stephen flew in halfway through our shoot. We were there for 2 months. And he walked into a longhouse and he saw 250 men and women in full ritual regalia in the midst of a 3-day ceremony that celebrated the fertility of cassava woman. and he couldn't resist getting on the satellite phone and calling his wife, who had lived with him in the Barasan in 1968, and he said, "Christine, you won't believe it. The only thing that disappeared are the fucking missionaries." And people are always saying, you know, that these cultures are destined to fade away. I'll tell you that's not the case. People are always saying, well, what can we do? We can do everything. What in fact happened in the case of the people of the Anaconda is that there was an inspired president, Barco, Virgilio Barco, father of a good friend of mine, who said to my good friend Martin von Hildebrand, a young anthropologist, "Martin, do something for the Indians." And Martin, in 5 years of head of Indian affairs, did more than something for the Indians, as they say, of Colombia. He secured legal land tenure to an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for 57 ethnicities that was encoded in the Constitution of 1991 of Colombia. And in the wake of them having their land, and with the isolation caused by the chaos of the drug war, with the federal state having no presence in an area of land the size of France, an entirely new dream of culture was born. And when we made this film, I asked some of the elders why it had been that they had allowed the missionaries into their lives in such a destructive way. And they said something very profound. They said, because they promised they could make us human beings. And this is the essence of colonization, is to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. And we can discuss this a great deal, but it's important to recall that these events did not happen in some distant 19th century. They happened in my lifetime, and they are still happening today. Genocide, the physical extinction of a people, is universally condemned. Ethnocide, the destruction of a people's way of life, is not only not condemned in many quarters of the world, it's promoted as appropriate development policy. Now, on a lighter note, Schultes not only told me to take ayahuasca. As I walked out of his office, he handed me a letter that might have well been written by Charles Darwin or by God himself, of the doors that it would open in South America. And then he said to me I should look up his man in Colombia, Timothy Plowman. And Timothy was Schultes' great protege, and Timothy had done for Schultes had done for Timothy the impossible. He had secured the dream academic grant of the 1970s, $250,000 and a brand new red Dodge Power Wagon pickup truck to study a plant known to the Inca as the divine leaf of immortality. And this, of course, was Coca, the notorious source of cocaine. And it was a remarkable assignment because even though cocaine hydrochloride remained our most important topical anesthetic, and even though we knew that millions of South American Indians consume the plant every day, very little was known about the botanical source of the drug. We knew that in the time of the Inca it was revered as no other plant. You could not approach a holy shrine if you did not have coca in your mouth. The Inca, unable to cultivate the plant at the elevation of the imperial capital of Cusco, replicated it in gold and silver leaf in fields that colored the horizon. And to this day in the Andes, no gesture occurs without the reciprocal exchange of the energy of the leaf with the Apu spirits, the mountain deities that dominate every community. No child can be brought into the realm of the living, no field harvested, no elder brought into the realm of the dead. And to the absolute horror of our backers at the U.S. government, we did the first nutritional study of coca, and what we found was surprising. It had a small amount of cocaine hydrochloride in it, 0.5 to 1% dry weight, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean, and nobody noticed the irony that at every drug abuse conference, all the narcs bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. But in addition to this very small amount of alkaloid absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane of the mouth, the plant was chock full of vitamins. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet, particularly for young mothers, a diet that traditionally lacked a dairy product. It also had enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfectly adapted to the potato tuber-based diet of the Andes. And so in one simple scientific assay that could have been done 40 years ago, we put into stark profile the draconian efforts that are underway to this day to eradicate the traditional fields, and we showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for over 4,000 years. Now, with Coca, my lens, both metaphorically and literally, the ancient rhythms of the Andes slowly came into focus, and I became very interested in this notion of sacred geography. And again, I don't mean that to be part of the lexicon of hippie ethnography. I mean, what does it really mean for a people to believe that the earth is alive? What did it mean to us when Descartes, in a single gesture, saying that all that existed was mind, matter, and material, in a single gesture he deanimated all sentient beings but human beings, sweeping from discussion, myth, magic, mysticism, reaching a world, as Saul Bellow said, where science had made a house cleaning of belief. We can only do what we do to the earth environmentally because we believe it's not alive. But that's not how most people think of the world. You know, I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the scientific ideology of forestry that I was taught in school, and I practiced as an engineer in the woods. That made me very different than my friends amongst the First Nations of Vancouver Island, but who were raised to believe that those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwell at the north end of the world, spirits that the young initiate would have to embrace during the Hamet's initiation, such that he would bring back to the community at the potlatch the wisdom and energy of the wild. The interesting question isn't to say who's right and who's wrong. Is that forest mere cellulose and board feet? Is it the domain of the spirits? The interesting observation is how the belief system mediates the interaction between the human population and that natural landscape with profoundly different consequences in terms of the ecological footprint of any particular worldview. In the Andes, for example, it's believed that every village is dominated by a deity, an Apu, a mountain deity that will direct the destiny of the children. And so a child raised in such an environment is going to be a profoundly different human being with a different relationship to that mountain landscape than a Canadian lad raised in Nelson to believe in the fiber of their being that a mountain is simply a pile of inert rock ready to be mined. And this is so important because whenever we try to suggest that indigenous people have a different way of viewing the earth, we always invoke the old racist canard of Rousseau and the noble savage, or we suggest that they're somehow more Thoreauian than we can be. Indigenous people all around the world are neither weakened by nostalgia, nor are they sentimental. There's not a room for either emotion in the harsh winds of the Arctic or in the mountains of Tibet, but indigenous people throughout the world have nevertheless forged a traditional mystique of the earth that's based not on the idea of being self-consciously close to it, but on a far more subtle intuition, and that is the idea that the earth itself only exists because it's breathed into being by the human imagination. And that conviction is reaffirmed through ritual. And once each year, in a community that I've worked in for 35 years, Chinchero, stunningly beautiful community right outside of Cusco, site of the summer palace of Topa Inca Yupanqui, the second of the great Incan rulers. There were only three. The fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman. And for one day, he puts on the clothing of his sister or his mother and becomes a wailaka, a transvestite figure. And he has to carry the banners of the community and lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, you run 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain Antiquilca, and then you run to 16,000 feet, fall down toward the sacred valley, and cross two more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a marathon of a day. The entire circumference of the run marks the boundaries of the community, boundaries that are highlighted with sacred piles of dirt, Ethos, mojones, where the wailaka must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop, where Coca is given to Pachamama, where libations of alcohol are given to the wind. And the metaphor is so wonderful. You go into the mountain run as an individual, but through exhaustion and sacrifice. And remember that the word sacrifice comes from the Latin to make sacred. You emerge by the end of day as a single community that has reaffirmed your place on the planet. And if we go back to the Enlightenment and Descartes, one of the things that we did in the Enlightenment in our particular culture is, in order to free ourselves of the tyranny of the medieval church, we liberated the individual from the community and the collective. That gave the individual great comfort, but cast the individual adrift in a world without the support of fellows, without the security of faith. It was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. But in these communities, community counts for more, because without the strength of the community, everybody suffers. Now, at the age of 48, I became the first outsider ever to be invited to participate in the movimiento, the oldest man ever to run it. And in the middle of the race, when they realized I was going to actually do this, they stopped everything and formally adopted me into a community that had been my home for 30 years. But I must tell you that the only way I got through the race was by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the plant. But what really got me through is that I had baptized so many children and raised so many children and paid for more cows than you can imagine, and school supplies and everything else. And so when all my godchildren learned that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they all clustered around me like limpets, and they weren't about to let anything happen to their cash cow. Now, these localized rituals become pan-Andean in these fantastic events like the Koiriti, where once each year, in a kind of a Woodstock kind of scene, tens of thousands of indigenous people from all through the Andes gather in a sacred valley of the Sinicara at the base of 3 tongues of a glacier that comes down from the mountaintop. It's a perfect fusion of the kind of syncretic world of the pan-Andean civilization today, 500 years of Catholic faith on top of thousands of years of pre-Columbian convictions. And so the symbolism is very much of the church, the stages of the cross, as the individuals carry the crosses from their own home villages up into the mountain valley, all though done in the shadow of the most sacred mountain of the Inca, Ausangati. The crosses are placed in the ice for 24 hours. This incredible ritual unfolds, and then they're carried back the following day. Now, these contemporary events even allow us to understand finally such iconic but mysterious places as Machu Picchu. How many of you have been to Machu Picchu? Lots of you. That doesn't surprise me in Nelson. I'm sure it was said to you that it was a lost city. Well, it was only a lost city in the marketing fantasies of the National Geographic. Machu Picchu was built by Pachacuti, the first of the great Inca rulers, beginning in 1438 when he defeated the Chanca and began the revolution of the universe. And in the 1460s, he began his work at Machu Picchu, and you just have to look at Machu Picchu and you can see that it's tied into the network of royal roads, the tens of thousands of roads that were built in the 1 century of Incan domination of the Andes. But more importantly, Machu Picchu is tied into notions of sacred geography. If you went to the Intihuatana, the hitching post to the sun, you'll notice that the light that falls upon it is always echoing the light that falls upon Huayna Picchu, which is the Apu of Machu Picchu. If you come this side of Huayna Picchu, you'll find an altar. If you go to the top of Huayna Picchu, you'll find another altar. All of this was worked out by Johann Reinhard, another explorer in residence of the Geographic, the man who found the perfectly preserved Incan sacrifice on the mountain, on the top of Ampato, the so-called Ice Maiden. Johann discovered that if you took a direct north-south bearing from these 2 altars, it not only bisects the Intihuatana, it goes to the horizon and hits the heart of the second most sacred mountain of the Incan Empire, which is Salcantay. At the time of when the Milky Way is in the sky, it arches across the summit of Salcantay. The Southern Cross, one of the most important of the Incaic constellations, again is in this perfect alignment. And yet if you climb Machu Picchu mountain, you look down below and you see the Vilcabamba, the Vilcanota, and this serpentine river envelops the site, but in Incaic belief, the Urubamba was the earthly equivalent of the Milky Way. And yet, where is the river born? In the very ice fields of the Coyariti. So 500 years after Columbus, still the people are pursuing this ancient rhythm of the Andean sense of sacred geography. Now, if the sounds of the southern Andes are the sounds of a syncretic world, there is one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice can still be heard unfettered, and that is in this remarkable complex of peoples of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta of Colombia. This is an isolated volcanic massif that soars to 20,000 feet right out of the coastal plain of Colombia. And the inhabitants of the mountains, the Wiwa, the Kogi, the Canquano, and the Arhuacos, are descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization that carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia. In the wake of the conquest, they retreated into this massif where to this day they are ruled by a ritual priesthood. But the training for the priesthood is rather astonishing. Reichel Domatov, the great Colombian anthropologist, reported in the 1940s that the young acolytes were taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, 2 9-year periods chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation they spend in their natural mother's womb. Now they're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother. And for that entire time, they're on a ritual diet as they're enculturated in the values of their society, values that maintain the proposition that their prayers literally maintain the ecological or the cosmic balance. And at the end of this incredible initiation, the acolyte is taken out into the sunshine and for the first time in his life sees the horizon of this stunningly beautiful homeland. He is then taken on pilgrimage, and as he moves through the mountains, the priest who has trained them says, "You see, it's as I've told you all these years. It's that beautiful. It's yours to protect." Now, this was almost too good to believe, and no anthropologist, including Reichel Domatov, had actually witnessed one of these events. And then a wonderful thing happened. This man, Danilo Villafana, walked into my office at the National Geographic about 4 years ago, with Virgilio Barco's daughter, Carolina, who was the Colombian ambassador to Washington. And he was with 3 mamos, or priests, all barefoot on a winter's day in Washington, not one of whom could speak a word of Spanish. And as I was chatting with Danilo, I interrupted him and I said, "I don't mean to be rude, but you look an awful lot like an old friend of mine." And I showed him this photograph from the book One River, and the man on the right is his father, as it turned out, Adalberto. And Adalberto had been murdered by the paramilitaries. The man to Adalberto's side, to my left, is Eugenio, who today is this revered elder, second from the left. And I said to Danilo, as I showed him this photograph, "You may not remember me, but when you were a baby boy, I carried you on my back for months with your father." And based on this incredible serendipitous connection, Danilo invited us not only to go back to the mountains, but to take a film crew and actually document one of these journeys to the heart of the world. And the metaphor in Arawaco life is loom. They say, "Upon this loom I weave my life." As they move up and down the slopes of their homeland, exploiting various ecological niches, they refer to their movements as threads, so that over the course of a lifetime, a man weaves a cloth over the flank of Saranqua, the great goddess. And we discovered that at least today, the young initiates are not kept in the darkness for 18 years, but they are kept in the environs of the men's temple on a ritual diet, much of the time indeed at night, as they learn in the temple, as they learn the complex Baroque religiosity of the values of this society. And then they are indeed taken to the heart of the world. Every ripple in the landscape resonates with spiritual significance. The idea is you take objects from the sea to the ice, from the ice to the sea, to complete the sacred cycle of the divine. Even the hats they weave out of sisal are a conscious attempt to mimic the snowfields found on the flank of Saranqua at the center of the world. And as we got to the ultimate penultimate stop in the ritual cycle, suddenly we found the elders in a circle, and when they pray, they move their fingers like this because prayers are as threads. And what had happened is that the FARC had come through but 2 hours before attempting to kidnap us. And I can't say you can have a dramatic escape on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But we had to abandon all of our gear in the light of a spectral moon. Adalberto and Regilio led us up these tracks in the cliff faces that only the indigenous people knew about. And then at dawn, just when we felt we were free, we ran into a FARC patrol. And when we got to the base of the mountain, we realized we had walked into a hornet's nest, and there was an entire firefight between the 16th Colombian Battalion and the FARC, all of which, of course, only brings agony to the peoples of the mountain. And mercifully, we had been training at their request Arawaco cinematographers, so we simply handed over our high-definition camera to one of our colleagues, and he finished the film for us. And what's amazing is you can't tell where the Bollywood director's footage ends and Roberto's footage begins. And we went back to the sea, where even though the sacred sites are now covered by concrete skyscrapers and brothels, it doesn't keep the elder brothers from doing their mission. And their mission is to pray for all of us. They believe literally that they are the elder brothers that hold in their palm the fate of the world, and they dismiss the rest of us who have violated the world as being the younger brothers. And they speak in full paragraphs with great articulation as to our need to treat the earth in a different way. And it's humbling to think that even as we sit here in Nelson, the Arawakos in the Sierra Nevada, not 2 hours from Miami Beach, are praying intently for the well-being of all humanity and the earth itself. Well, I've always sort of lived by the adage of Marshall McLuhan that if it works, it's obsolete. And just when I had spent 4 years in South America thinking only of plants and indigenous people, I was keen for a change. And there was always something lurking in the fourth floor office of Professor Schultes. And early in February of 1982, he summoned me to his office and asked me very casually if I was interested to go down to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrate the secret societies, and secure the formula of a drug used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said yes. And I went down to Haiti thinking that it might be a lark, having no idea that this fortnight would lead to 4 years of my life, because within 24 hours of arriving in the Afro-Caribbean reality, something was made available to me that had eluded me in the Amazon, and that was truly a window wide open to the mystic. You know, it's interesting, were I to ask you the great religions of the world, what would you say? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever. There's always one continent left out, sub-Saharan Africa, the tacit assumption being that African people had no religious beliefs. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. The word voodoo is simply a fond word from Dahomey that means spirit or God. And the religion is in fact a quintessentially democratic faith because the believer not only has direct access to the divine, he or she actually becomes the God. The belief is that human beings, when they die, dissociate. The physical body goes into the earth, and the spirit of the individual is captured or taken by a voodoo priest and placed into a vessel which is placed in the inner sanctum of the temple. In time, that spirit associated with a particular ancestor becomes part of the ancestral pool of energy out of which emerge the archetypes. And the archetypes are the 401 lois, or spirits of the pantheon, which are seen as the multiple expressions of a greater God. And but in this quintessentially democratic faith, even the dead must be made to serve the living. To serve the living, they must become manifest. To become manifest, the spirits must respond to the rhythm of the drums, to come back from beneath the world of the invisibles, to momentarily displace the soul of the living, so that for that brief shining moment, human being and God become one and the same. This is spirit possession. It's not some kind of psychological breakdown. It's a hand of divine grace. And that's why the African people say, you white people go to church and speak about God. We dance in the temple and become God. And indeed, in Africa, people move in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and impunity that has always astonished the ethnographic observer. And of course, because you're taken by the spirit, how can your body be harmed? You are the god. So you see these dramatic displays cutting into the skin before a fetish symbol, or more profoundly in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning embers with impunity, a rather extraordinary example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. Where did we get this idea of voodoo being evil? Well, the U.S. Marine Corps occupied Haiti in the 1920s. Of everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. The books had names like Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, Cannibal Cousins, the Magic Island, The White King of La Gonave, Voodoo, A Puritan in Voodoo Land. And all of these books were filled with children bred for the cauldron, pins and needles and voodoo dolls that don't exist, and zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people. They gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead, Zombies on Broadway, this White Zombie Slave. And all of this pulp fiction and cheap films suggested to the American people during the era of Jim Crow and segregation that any country where such abominations occurred could only find its redemption in military occupation. And the truth is, voodoo is a divine, beautiful religion. It is simply the faith of Africa. So, in the end, we have this notion that these cultures are somehow quaint and colorful, but destined to fade away as if by natural law, as if they're failed attempts at being us, failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is no threat to culture. The Nishka no more stopped being the Nishka when they began to use rifles than an American farmer stopped being an American when he went from the horse and buggy to the automobile. Technology is no threat to culture, and change is no threat to culture. All peoples, in fact, are constantly dancing with new possibilities for life. It is neither change nor technology that threatens the integrity of culture. It is power. In every case, these are not delicate peoples. These are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable sources. And that's actually an optimistic observation because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. I wrote a book about my voodoo experience, The Serpent and the Rainbow, that was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw the book over, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I slipped away to the forests of Borneo. I wanted to live with the last nomads of Southeast Asia, the Penan, because I've always been enchanted by nomadic peoples because we were all once nomads, wanderers on a pristine planet. It was only with the Neolithic Revolution 12,000 years ago that we all succumbed to the cult of the seed, and the poetry of the shaman became the prose of the priesthood. But in nomadic societies, life is very different. How, for example, do you measure wealth in a society in which there is a disincentive to acquire anything? Well, in this community, wealth is defined explicitly as the strength of social relations between people, because if those relations fray, everybody will suffer. Sharing is an involuntary reflex, so there is no word for thank you in the Penan language, because food is always shared. Indeed, the greatest transgression in this community is a failure to share. I once gave a cigarette to a little Penan woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute equitably the individual strands of tobacco to every hut of the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And in these societies, and I've found this even with my good friends of Gitsan or Taltan origin, the elders, in these societies that did not have the written word, we think of writing as this great advance of civilization. In one sense it was, but it was by definition a tool designed to numb memory. In oral traditions, memory is acute, and the entire knowledge is encoded in the vocabulary of the best storyteller. And so in the same way that we can hear the voices of a character when we read a novel, my experience has been that many elders can hear the voices of animals in some sense in nature, such that the flight of a hornbill becomes a cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But sadly, by the time I got to Borneo the sounds of the forest had become the sounds of machinery. At a time when Brazil produced but 1% of the world's tropical log exports, 45% came from the East Malaysian state of Sarawak, much of it from the homeland of the Penang. So in a single generation, their world was turned upside down. Women forced into servitude and prostitution, rivers that once ran clear, so laden with silt that it seemed as if all of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea, where the Japanese and Korean freighters hung light on the horizon, ready to fill their holds with raw logs ripped from the heart of the forest. Children forced into settlement camps, women overwhelmed, men humiliated, eventually standing up, a quixotic gesture, blowpipes against bulldozers, no power match for the power of the Malaysian state. And I was in Tibet not long ago when my good friend Ian Mackenzie, a linguist who works with the Penang, emailed me to let me know that the last of the Penang had settled. And so here was a way of life, morally inspired, inherently right, with an acute knowledge of that forest homeland that would put any Harvard PhD to shame, and yet within a single generation, their world had been turned upside down, and their spirit and their society had been crushed along with the force that gave it birth. And I want to stress that these egregious industrial intrusions are not limited to distant realms. This is my closest friend in the Tahltan, Oscar Dennis, and I must tell you that when this photograph was published in the National Geographic, women from all around the world made a beeline for Iskut. And Oz would call me up and he'd say, you know, Wade, there's this woman from Poland coming to see me. And I say, brother, look, you had someone from Russia there last week. I know. I said, man, you don't even speak Russian or Polish. Well, you know, Wade, they don't really come for conversation. This man is such a beautiful man. I have to tell you one anecdote, that when Oz and I went to Peru to make that film at the Coyariti, and he never drinks, and all film crews drink at night. So Oz started hanging out with the street urchins in the plaza of Cusco, and he noticed one night that there was this two look-alike kids, but they came on alternative nights, and he realized there were two brothers who only had one pair of shoes that they shared between them. So Oz made a deal with them. He promised them that if they taught him Spanish, he'd buy them all shoes. And at the end of our shoot, Oz marched these street urchins into the poshest shoe shop in Cusco, and not only bought them shoes, but insisted that the owner personally measure the foot of every street urchin. And they all walked out with 20 pairs of new shoes. But of course, Oz and the Tahltan people live in a place unique in all of the world, the Sacred Headwaters. By a remarkable miracle of geography, our three great salmon rivers of home, the Nass, the Skeena, and the Stikine, are born in the same meadows. It's a place known as the Sacred Headwaters because each of these rivers is deeply associated with one of the great civilizations of the northwest coast. Of course, the Stikine, the Tahltan, the Tlingit, the Nass with the Nishka, and of course the Skeena with the Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en, the Carrier, the Haisla, and indeed the Haida themselves, because the salmon of Haida Gwaii depend on the artery of the Skeena. And in the tsunami of economic development that I was speaking about today at Selkirk College, as many as 41 industrial developments are intended for the Tahltan country, a country that is so remarkably wild and extraordinary. It's the kind of place we as Canadians could throw England and the English would never find it. And for a decade now, the Tahltan, men and women, elders in wheelchair, have stood up in defense of their homeland. And mercifully, before Christmas, Royal Dutch Shell, which at one point had a proposal to insert as many as 6,500 coal bed methane extractive wellheads and a network of pipes and roads at the very meadows of the Sacred Headwaters, has properly and to their credit retreated, giving this land the promise of hope. But there are still great threats. Tottigan Mountain, a wildlife sanctuary in the sky, home to the largest population of stone sheep in the world, a resident population that attracts huge concentrations of grizzly and wolf, is now the site of an open-pit copper and gold mine that will process 30,000 tons of rock a day for 30 years. By the project design, it will inundate the lakes of the Sacred Headwaters with toxic tailings, destroying this population of wildlife. And indeed, this is a mountain that anchors the 9 lakes of the headwaters of the Iskut, one of the most beautiful places that I've ever seen in the world. To put an open-pit copper and gold mine, of which there are 4,000 on the planet, on top of Tawdagan Mountain is rather like drilling for oil in the Sistine Chapel. And for a decade, the Tahltan elders have resisted this violation of their homeland, and we're just now entering a new campaign. Please go to the site of SWCC, check out my book, The Sacred Headwaters, all profits of which go to the cause. And right now, we're trying to drive this mine underground. The most amazing thing about it, and this is, again, to draw a distinction between the indigenous peoples of the world. You know, what does it take to get a mine established in British Columbia? Well, you cobble together a company with less history than my dog. You get online and you secure the subsurface rights to a place you've never been, the stories you've never heard, the pain of a long winter you've never experienced, nor the promise of a bright spring. And as long as you can promise a government a flow of revenue in the forms of royalties or taxation, you, by definition, a private individual, secure the right to transform that land for all time. But what's fascinating is there's not a single metric in the calculus that rationalizes the industrialization of the wild that places any value whatsoever on the land left alone, or any cost to the commons implicit, inherent in its destruction. We take that for granted because it's the way that we industrialize the wild. But it's very much like me coming to your garden in Nelson in a few months' time, and you're selling roses, and I agree to buy all of your roses. And I'm such a good corporate citizen that I even employ your children to pluck the roses for me. But then as I turn away, having transacted the roses, I then say, oh, by the way, I'm destroying your house. And you say, wait a minute, where's the compensation for my house? Well, I don't know. This is a transaction about coal. This is a transaction about copper. This is not about, your house. And I walk away from it. Well, that's effectively what we do. And that can only be done by a people who have completely turned their back on the spiritual residence of the earth itself. And that's not something that the Tahltan people share, because for them the Sacred Headwaters is a nursery of unknown generations. And the generations still to come, they believe, are the ones who have the greatest voice in the destination of the country. And just to go to the other extreme, let me take you into the deserts of Australia, just to stress that the way we do it is anomalous. It's not the norm. When the British first washed ashore in Australia, they saw people who looked strange, had a primitive technology, a simple technology. But what really offended the British about the Aboriginal people of Australia is that they had never embraced the cult of progress. They had no interest in improving upon their lot. And this was deeply offensive to the British because, of course, progress, self-improvement, moving forward was the ethos of Victorian Europe. And it was an ethos that incidentally was crushed in the mud and blood of Flanders, but it was very much alive during the early colonial days of Australia. And in the inimitable way of the British, they concluded that the Aboriginal people weren't human beings at all, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human beings or not. As recently as the 1960s, there was a school book in Australia, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, that included the Aboriginal people as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife in the continent. What was actually going on was a subtle devotional philosophy beyond the reach of the British to comprehend, and this was the dreaming. We know from studies of the Y chromosome that the ancestors of the Australian Aborigines were the very first people to walk out of Africa. Within 5,000 years, they crossed the underbelly of Asia, and even then managed to get across the ocean waters that separated New Guinea from the most parsimonious continent on the earth. They then reached that continent and they went walking. And over the course of generations, they established tens of thousands of clan territories like a matrix on Australia. And connecting all of those clan territories were two ideas. The song lines, which was the trajectory walked at the dawn of time when the ancestral beings sang the universe into existence, and the dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a state of perpetual reality where past, present, and future were always one and the same. In not one of the 670 languages and dialects of Australia was there a word for past, present, or future, or for time. There was only the dreaming. And the world at your foot both existed, but was also waiting to be born in the realm of the dreaming. So the world that existed in the phenomenological sense was also constantly in a state of being created. So how could you create a cult of improvement in a world that hadn't taken form yet? It would be like trying to get your embryo into Harvard. It made no sense whatsoever. And indeed, as we now know, the entire purpose of life in Australia was the antithesis of progress. It was stasis. This was the most conservative worldview ever to come out of the human imagination. The entire purpose of life was not to improve upon anything, but rather to do the ritual gestures in your clan territory deemed to be necessary to keep the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation. It would be as if all of human intellectual thought in the West had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had that fateful conversation. Now, the interesting thing isn't to say who's right and wrong. Had humanity as a whole followed this intellectual trajectory, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon. But we also wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biological life support systems of the planet itself. Now, very often, the threat to culture is not just ideological, it's not just industrial, it's ideological. This is a photograph that I took at Angkor Wat of a nun who you can see had her hands and feet severed from her body during the era of Pol Pot for the crime of pursuing her religious faith. This is a man I met just last October at Angkor Wat, and I was astonished to see him, because it was the first time in 10 visits to Cambodia that I've ever encountered anyone my own age, because of course my entire age cohort was wiped out in the killing fields. And if we go from Cambodia into Tibet, where I spent a great deal of time, you begin to understand what it meant when Mao Zedong, the man with the dubious distinction of having been responsible for the death by murder of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together, when His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, as a young man, was told by Mao that all religion was poison, His Holiness knew what to expect. And in the wake of the final conquest of Tibet in 1959, 1.2 million Tibetans were killed for their religious beliefs. 6,000 temples were torn apart, dust by dust, brick by brick, battered by artillery, blown up from the sky. And what was it about the Buddhist Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing, who celebrated an ideology invented by a German philosopher and distilled in the reading room at the British Library? What was it that the Buddha taught? It's distilled in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life was negation. He meant that shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths is that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that these are photographs I took last week in Bhutan, so this is fun to see them. The third of the Noble Truths was his revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth, and the most consequential, was a delineation of a contemplative practice that, if pursued, had 2,500 years of empirical observation and scientific proof that enlightenment could indeed be achieved. And so I set off with my good friend Mathieu Ricard to tell the story of the Buddhist science of the mind. And you can see from this photograph that traveling in the Himalaya with Mathieu was a little bit like being in Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. He was the most extraordinary man. His father was France's most famous Descartesian philosopher who wrote a 2-volume history of Western philosophy from memory. Mathieu's mother was a great famous painter. If you can believe it, his house was so full of luminaries that he learned piano from Stravinsky. He learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson. He learned anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was studying molecular biology in a lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute when he realized there was no correlation between happiness, fame, and wealth. And so he went back to the place he'd always been happy and became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And with another friend, Shara Barma, a traditional Amchi doctor, here looking rather quizzically at my urine sample, we set out on a journey to tell a story of a real wisdom hero, a bodhisattva. And this is a hero's journey that took us from the realm of Tulsi Rinpoche, head of the Nyingma tradition, teacher of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. We began at Rinpoche's monastery of Chiwang that clings like a swallow's nest to the mountains of Solukhumbu in Nepal. The Manirimdu ceremony, 16-day ritual that commemorates the transmission of the Dharma during the era of Guru Rinpoche to Tibet, a ceremony that celebrates all the forms of life itself. And then we began our journey toward Everest, not to climb the mountain as Westerners are known to do, flinging themselves to a zone of death where the oxygen deprivation alone obliterates consciousness, what for the Buddhists would be about the stupidest thing you could ever do. We went to be in the presence of a true Dharma hero. This is a woman who, as a young girl, had been betrothed to a merchant when all she wanted to do was pursue the Dharma. She escaped his clutches by crawling down a human latrine, and covered with human excrement, she turned up at the foot of the Lama of Tempoche Monastery. She then was cleaned up by the nuns and sent across the Nangpala Pass into Tibet, where she became ordained as a Tibetan nun, and then came back to Solukhumbu and had gone into lifelong retreat. And for 45 years, she had lived in a cell no bigger than the corner of the stage here. And because she was elderly, Shara Barma, my friend, was treating her medically. So we went on this pilgrimage of the heart, stopping in the cave here where Sherab is 1 year of his 7 years of medical training had spent in solitary retreat. And as Matru chanted the sutras, we found our way to the monastery. And this is a photograph that opened for the first time, allowing sunlight in 45 years on the face of this Tibetan nun. You would have expected to encounter a madwoman. Instead, we met a woman whose face radiated loving compassion. She immediately took Mathieu to task for the unnecessarily Baroque rituals of the male-dominated monasteries, and she said, all you need is a mantra. For 45 years, night and day, awake, asleep, she had simply recited a single mantra. And as we moved away from her and let the door shut on her life once more, I ran into a Lama who said something very powerful to me. He said, you know, we in Tibet don't really believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. And of course, the tragedy of modern Tibet is a jackboot of the Chinese, and it leaves it to us to ask why we allow the wrath of China to continue to sweep over this homeland of a worldview that has given so much to humanity. This is contemporary Lhasa, a photograph I took last October, where there are security cameras, machine gun nests, military roadblocks virtually at every single corner. And yet the Tibetans still pursue the breath of the Dharma, still spending all of their lives coming to terms with a moment that we pretend does not even exist. And that, of course, is the moment of death. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? A kind of monochromatic world of monotony, or do we want to celebrate a polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said before she died that her greatest fear was that as we drifted toward this blandly amorphous world, not only would the entire range of the human imagination be reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but we would wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there are other possibilities of life itself. The other peoples of the world all have something to tell us. Every culture deserves a place at the council of human knowledge. And the reason this is so significant is not simply because of an issue of human rights or certainly romantic nostalgia. It's really a matter of geopolitical survival, because if there's one lesson of anthropology, it's that culture matters, that culture is not trivial, culture is not decorative, it's not the songs we sing, the prayers we utter, the costumes we adorn ourselves with. Ultimately, culture is about a body of moral and ethical values that we place around every individual human being, to keep the barbaric heart at bay that history teaches us lies just beneath the surface of each of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in a universe that may have none, to do as Lincoln said, always reach for the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost and the constraints of tradition are violated, and individuals either through coercion or their own volition turn their backs on tradition only to secure a lowest rung on an economic ladder that goes nowhere, to enter a sea of disaffection and alienation, you just have to look at the points of conflict in the world. This is a photograph I took just 10 days ago in Kigali, in Rwanda. These are the faces of the Tutsi dead from the genocide. This was a concept completely created by the Belgians and the Germans, the idea that there were two ethnicities within Rwanda, Tutsi and Hutu, perhaps 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, but for generations they had lived in peace, sharing the same language. And suddenly, this mania grew out of the chaos of modernity and decolonization. And before you know it, in a single 100-day period, nearly 1 million Tutsi were slaughtered by machetes. This is indeed the fate of those who enter that realm of chaos created by the death of culture. But fortunately, we're recognizing even in Canada, and laudably in Canada, that the nation states are the indigenous people are no embarrassment to the nation state. On the contrary, they enrich the nation state if the nation state is prepared to accept diversity. You know, when the British first went to the Arctic, they met a people who they saw as savages. The Inuit people saw the British as gods. Both were wrong, but one did more to honor the human race. And what the British failed to understand was that there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in the Arctic on a technology that was limited to what you could carve from bone and stone and forge from the cold. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row and wrapped in the skin of a caribou carcass. And the Inuit don't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. And when the British mimicked their ways, they achieved great feats of exploration, but for the most part, they persisted in trying to import their own environment with them. And when the last of Lord Franklin's men were found frozen to death at Starvation Cove in the Adelaide Peninsula, the young sailors were dragging behind them a sled made in Manchester, England, of oak and iron that weighed 500 pounds. On top of it was a dory from Franklin's ship that weighed 300 pounds. Inside the dory were all the accoutrements of a British naval officer's dinner service, including silver plate and a copy of the novel The Vicar of Wakefield. And this they somehow expected to drag through the barren lands of northern Canada, hoping they might bounce into a Hudson Bay post and achieve salvation. Well, they suffered terrible deaths, but the Inuit, by contrast, moved lightly on the land. This is a photograph I took 250 kilometers out on the sea ice with my friends from Igloolik, polar bear hunting. That night the temperature dropped to minus 65 Celsius before the wind came up. They made an igloo, we crawled into the skins, ate flesh, and despite what Greenpeace says, blood on ice in the Arctic is not a sign of death, it's an affirmation of life itself. And when I was narwhal hunting at the tip of Baffin Island, I recorded a wonderful story from Olayak, an elder from Arctic Bay. And during the 1950s, a dark period in Canadian history, and I'll end tonight with this anecdote, the Canadian government forced the Inuit in the settlements both to treat a tuberculosis epidemic, but also to establish sovereignty in an archipelago that could have gone back to the Europeans or to the Americans. And Olayak's grandfather categorically refused to go into the settlements. So the family, fearful for his life, took away all of his weapons, all of his tools, thinking that that would force him into the settlements. Did it? No. In the middle of an Arctic night with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped outside of the igloo, pulled down his caribou hide and sealskin trousers, and defecated into his hand. As Ephesus began to freeze, he shaped it in the form of an implement, and when the implement forged by the cold from human waste took final form, he put a spray of saliva along the leading edge to sharpen it. He then killed a dog with a shit knife, skinned the dog with it, improvised a sled with the rib cage of the dead dog, a harness with the skin of the dead dog, harnessed up an adjacent living dog, and then shit knife and belt disappeared into the Arctic night. Now talk about getting by with nothing. Now, you may think, as I certainly thought, that they were pulling my leg when they told, isn't that a perfect tale to tell an anthropologist? But in the journals of Peter Freuchen, who was with Knut Rasmussen on the Fifth Thule expedition, there's a marvelous passage where he gets caught out in a blizzard. He makes a trough in the snow. He pulls his sled on top of him, inadvertently makes a coffin of his own making, and he can't get out. And in his journal, he says very casually, I thought of making a shit knife, but I really couldn't maneuver, so I did this. I'm not saying there's an assembly line making shit knives in the Arctic, but if you have ever lived in the Arctic, cold is not your enemy, it's your friend. And so I want to stress that cold now is no longer there. This is a photograph that I took in Kanak, the northernmost community in the world, where the elders had made the wise decision to forbid skidoos in their country. You know, this stresses the important point that Hugh Brody makes, that it's not about the traditional versus the modern, but rather the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. When you land in Kanak, you see wonderful little Danish houses. You see wonderful clinic, co-op store, elder center. Everybody's got DVDs. Everybody's got cell phones. What you don't see is skidoos. Because the elders realized that dogs were the cultural pivot, and that not only did dogs allow you to stay free on the ice, independent of the cash economy, not worried about animals breaking down or running out of gas, but more importantly, the lineage of knowledge, the pedagogy of teaching girls and boys, fathers and mothers teaching boys and girls about the art of running dogs, was the glue that kept the culture together. And as a result, the community is much healthier than many of the corresponding communities across the way in Baffin Island. But sadly, as in all of the Arctic, they are now confronting something beyond their capacity. And you know, this is a great tragedy. Here the Inuit people in a single lifetime had to deal with the residential schools, the culture of welfare, the drug and alcohol problems, the missionaries who destroyed the integrity of the shaman. And just when, in the creation of Nunavut, they're finally having their opportunity for both social justice, political freedom, and a way to craft their own destiny, suddenly there is something happening across the Arctic beyond anyone's control, and that's climate change. In Kanak, the ice used to form in September and stay till July. Now it forms in November and it's gone by March. When I did the Massey lectures, the publisher put a subtitle on Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. And just to end tonight, I answered that question in the book implicitly, explicitly, but in the end, I really came down to two words: climate change. Not to suggest that we go back to a pre-industrial past or that any of the brilliance of modernity be kept from any people on the planet, but the very existence of these other ways of being, these other visions of life itself, put the lie to those who say that we cannot change, as we know we all must change, the fundamental way we inhabit this planet. We are not on a train wreck to disaster. These other cultures offer a way out. Not that we mimic them or that they mimic us, but simply that if we listen to their voices, we know that we can change our ways. We've been living in a world of projections and arrows when we need to live in a world of circles. To define perpetual growth on a finite planet is designed by delusion. For 2 centuries now, we've been consuming the ancient sunlight of the world. It's time to simply live another way. And there are so many voices out there telling us that that is indeed a possibility. And in the end, we need to listen to these voices as they need to hear what we have to say, because for all of us and for all time, the prayers of these Tibetan monks, the thoughts of this young Maasai lad I was just with in the Serengeti, they stand apart as part of our collective and naked geography of hope. Thank you very much.